French President Emmanuel Macron is making his annual address to French ambassadors today. He's been covering so far a series of topics, including France's role in Africa and what he called a weakening of the West's role in the world. Let's listen.
I believe our policy is the correct one. It's based on the courage of President Bazoum, on the efforts of our diplomats and our ambassador in Niger, who will stay despite pressure from coup leaders. We do not recognise them. We support the president, who's not resigned.
France 24's Angela Diffley was listening to that speech with me, a speech that's still going on after about a good hour and a half. Angela, Macron earlier was warning against what he called this risk of a weakening West. Tell us a bit more about that.
He was also referring to the BRICS Plus summit recently, this idea that Western dominance is really being challenged now. And he said, this is what's happening. We need to take notice of it. There is, if you just look at the Ukraine war, often a perspective from what we sometimes call the global south or any other countries outside the US and Europe, that when a country is invaded elsewhere in the world, it is seen as a territorial dispute. When it is a country which involves Europe or the US, it is seen as a matter of universal values and something quite different. That really irritates countries outside the West, and there's this growing challenge to the West. I think he wanted to talk a little about Africa as well, which he alluded to so much in that speech. Of course, we've all seen what's been happening in Niger in recent weeks. And this is an anti-Western narrative, but also an anti-French narrative, which is increasingly taking hold in Africa. We saw it in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger. Emmanuel Macron was very forceful in his defense of French interventions in those countries. He made absolutely clear to the ambassadors it needs to be got across to the world that those governments invited France in to help them try to combat jihadist forces. And he was very concerned about this narrative taking hold. These wars are often not popular within France. A lot of French soldiers die in them. And he was very keen to get across that this isn't France rampaging around Africa. Governments asked France in. They did make efforts to combat jihadists, limited success. He now says, we must be careful not to overstay our welcome. It is clear that these interventions need to be refrained. He talked about a new partnership with Kenya, which, of course, is not a former French colony. So that is something quite different. And he also mixed it with problems surrounding immigration here in France and this idea that France, as a former colonial power in Africa, is being portrayed around the world as not dealing well with its former colonies, being too close to governments. He said that France had perhaps made a mistake in being sometimes very good with its relationship with certain governments and nurturing that, but ignoring civil society and failing to take into account just how popular or unpopular those governments were. There are also implications, he said, for people who have backgrounds from those countries who now live in France. And he said, again, it needs to be got across to the outside world. Yes, France has made mistakes, as all former colonial powers have, but some of the positive elements of France's relationship with its former colonies, both outside in Africa and amongst descendants of those people within France.
Right, and we heard President Macron speaking earlier in that clip that we played for you about France's unwavering support for the president of Niger. We're going to focus a bit more on that in just a moment. But Angela, just tell us what else struck you from this speech, which Macron said was really a lucid assessment of the world, in his opinion.
Yeah, this was an extraordinary speech, looking at the entire world, although he said he wouldn't. We even talked about polar regions and also looking pretty much at the future and all its problems, ranging from mineral resources to artificial intelligence to climate challenges. And of course, the fact that everyone needs to pull together to work on them. Two very important takeaways. He talked about the European Union having a greater role with NATO. France has recently become much more supportive of Ukraine joining NATO. That is new. It's not new in this speech, but it's a recent development. It vetoed the idea of NATO membership or blocked it before. It knows that it's not going to join very soon because the US is against it. And the other idea, which is fairly new, which he alluded to, is expansion of the European Union. France in the past was very much against that.
Angela, thank you for that. France 24's Angela Diffley.